It is a pleasure to introduce today's first presenter, Dr. Joe Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a professor in the UAlbany program in Writing and Critical Inquiry, is an assistant director of the Writing and Critical Inquiry program, is a member of the Writing and Critical Inquiry AI Committee, and is the co-director of the C.H.A.T.S Film Festival and Lecture Series. His research is primarily concerned with early American literature, biblical hermeneutics, the epic hero, and digital humanities. In his classes, Joe often pairs early American lit with contemporary texts, questions, and issues to show how American culture has evolved over time. This afternoon, he will apply his expertise in the evolving American arts to Spike Jonze's contemporary romance, Her. Please welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Joe Meyer, and please stick around after the credits for a post-screening discussion.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. So I would like to make my way into discussing the 2013 film Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson, and directed by Spike Jonze, by first going back in time a bit to November 13th, 1959. The great writer Rod Serling was desperately trying to convince the world that there was a place in entertainment where fantasy and science fiction could meet. That place would come to be known as the Twilight Zone. Only 7 weeks into its run, audiences were treated to an episode entitled The Lonely. It stars the great actor Jack Warden as James Corey. Warden would, of course, also go on to work with a contemporary of Rod Serling's, Reginald Rose, who wrote 12 Angry Men, also starring Jack Warden. Rose would also write an episode for The Twilight Zone entitled The Incredible World of Horace Ford. This might seem like an early tangent, but I'm trying to establish my film and television bona fides to make the rhetorical moves that I need to make later on in this introduction. On that November 13th, 1959 night, audiences that tuned into this Twilight Zone witnessed a rather complex episode involving a man, James Corey, who was convicted of murder and given a life sentence, but not in a prison. Rather, Corey had to live out his sentence on an asteroid. Every month, someone would come and visit him to drop off supplies, but other than those visits, he was essentially in the largest, most open solitary confinement cell in history. All the freedom to move, but nowhere to go. Even though Corey was convicted of his crime, there were those who believed he acted in pure self-defense, and one of those supporters of Corey's innocence just happened to be the captain of the supply ship that visited him each month. Upon one visit, that captain left a rather large box. Now, if you haven't seen the episode, you still might know where I'm going here. In this box was Alicia, a robot, played by the equally talented Jean Marsh. Now, for those of us who grew up in the 80s, that's Queen Bev Morta from Willow. When Alicia comes alive and starts talking to Corey, his initial reaction is violent frustration. He throws her to the ground and tells her that she's nothing more than a mockery of his memory of women, a reminder that he's so lonely, he's about to lose his mind. As you might have guessed, however, little by little, he begins to warm up to her, and they are, for all intents and purposes, a loving couple. One day, the supply ship returns, and instead of bringing supplies, it brings news. The courts have found this type of punishment where people are banished to asteroids to be cruel, and sentences are pardoned. However, there's no time to waste. Corey must leave everything he has accumulated on that asteroid behind, and yes, that includes Alicia. Corey protests that Alicia isn't a thing, she's a woman. What happens next, however, is rather striking. In order to snap him out of this spell, the captain removes his gun and shoots Alicia in the face, exposing her wires, transistors, and metal interior. This has the desired effect, and Corey is able to leave the creature, that's Serling's word, not mine, behind, and join the rest of the people on the ship back to Earth. Okay, I begin with this rather lengthy plot synopsis for two reasons. One, I think Serling proposes one way for us to approach the film Her as a kind of understanding of the need for human beings to avoid loneliness as a mechanism for survival, whether it's a fully formed female robot or a volleyball named Wilson. Secondly, what's fascinating about the Twilight Zone's version of AC, or artificial companionship, is that it's both complex and simple at the same time. Alicia tells Corey that she has feelings, and she even cries at one point, but there's no expression of the need to be human. Corey even says to her, "You're a machine, aren't you?" To this, Alicia, in a rather matter-of-fact tone, says, "Yes." Alicia wants to be seen as an emotionally complex entity, but she isn't really struggling with her identity as a robot. This is quite different in Jones's Her, where Samantha, the AI operating system voiced by Scarlett Johansson, does struggle quite a bit with the process of negotiating her identity as a being. But why? For the remainder of this introduction, I would like to simply touch upon two key themes of Her that might shed some light on this struggle and prompt some additional pathways for conversation. Those two themes are perceptions of loneliness and differentiating change from evolution. We'll briefly explore both of these concepts through the lens of space. So first, loneliness and disconnect. Space is built into loneliness. In the most basic sense of the word, it is our perception of the absence of company. However, we can also flip that and think about it as a conscious awareness of our presence in relation to emptiness. In other words, the feeling of loneliness exists in both absence and presence. This understanding only covers the physical spaces, however. What about the metaphysical? Psychologists today define loneliness as a gap between one's desires for social connection and actual experiences of it. Again, here, we're dealing with the perception of space. And we even have ways of measuring one's loneliness based upon such perceptions. UCLA has developed a loneliness scale, which consists of 3 factors. The first factor relates to social others, a form of loneliness where one has less social networks with non-intimate others than desired. As in, there are people I can turn to. Factor 2 relates to an affiliative environment, a form of loneliness reflecting the lack of a general sense of belonging, as in, I feel a part of a group of friends. The third factor, intimate loneliness, captures the negative consequences of having a lower quantity or quality of intimate others than desired, as in, people are around me, but not with me. All 3 types of loneliness reflect a gap between desired and actual relationships, space. When we apply this scale to Theodore in Her, something interesting emerges. Toward the beginning of the film, Theodore seemingly has people that he can turn to in a non-intimate way. His friend Amy and her husband, Charles. But these interactions lack a sense of genuine connection, at least at the beginning. Theodore is merely in the background of their life, at one point even bearing witness to one of their fights, usually an intimate encounter for couples. But their comfort in fighting in front of him ends up signaling that they're not really concerned with his part in the relationship. I would argue they don't really see him as an integral or intimate partner in their friendship. In truth, Theodore lacks in all 3 factors of the UCLA loneliness scale, that is, until he meets Samantha, the OS, or operating system. As the film progresses, Samantha opens up the possibilities for Theodore to gain access to the various social groups mentioned in the UCLA study. He will turn to his friend Amy at one point. He will feel a sense of belonging when he joins one of his coworkers, Paul, played by Chris Pratt, on a double date. And he will experience various kinds of intimacy with Samantha. But one of the questions that I have for all of you as you watch the film is whether or not you believe that these experiences will actually carry over for Theodore. The ending seems to suggest an answer, but I'm not so sure. Perhaps a better phrasing for the question comes from psychologist Matt Abel of the National Institute for the Psychotherapies of New York, who summarizes the film Her as a witty, imaginative reflection of where we are and where we're headed, or a digital age that threatens to depersonalize us while offering us the promise of self-realization. I will openly admit, I'm not sure which one it is. The final theme I want to explore before we start the film is this idea of change versus evolution. Critic Nicholas Pappas identifies an interesting connection between Jones's film and the myth of Pandora. Before her arrival, Theodore lives a womanless life, just as Hesiod asserts that generations of mortal men had lived before Pandora's arrival. And if Samantha does not quite come to him from the gods, her final translation to a disembodied perfect state ultimately locates her in a godly domain. I would like to extend this discussion a bit and connect it with the subject of change versus evolution in her. We sometimes use these terms interchangeably when we discuss the complexity of human social relationships, but they aren't really synonyms. Evolution has its Latin roots in the word evolvere, or to turn out or unfold. When the sciences adopted this term, it added an important element of time. Evolution occurs gradually, and what emerges out of the transformation is something different than what it was when it began on a biological level. Change, however, does not need an element of time. It can happen quickly or over millennia. It also doesn't necessarily alter its host to a great extent. I can change my mind about something and still be me. I can also change my mind back to its original thought and still be me. However, if I alter my evolved DNA, well, that could prove rather costly or hysterical, one of the two. In her, I would argue that Theodore changes and Samantha evolves. And the key component that drives both of these is, again, space, and how they eventually come to interpret and utilize it quite differently. Toward the beginning of the film, Samantha is essentially a glorified Turing machine. As film critic Donna Kornhaber points out, Turing's innovation was to hold AI only to the performance of such personhood, on the theory that the performance of personhood is all that is ever really available to us anyway. We know others not through their being, but through their enactment of being. Samantha learns rather quickly what takes humans years. Performance is a natural part of being human. She performs what she believes is human. She even defies logic by doing things like sighing, an act of human exasperation or relief. But it also has the underlying biology of the need to draw breath, to measure out our frustration by the amount of oxygen we ingest and exhale. As Theodore points out at one point in the film, she doesn't need oxygen, so sighing doesn't really make sense. There is no biological imperative, and thus no real way to measure her true sense of frustration or relief. Now, I want to be careful in this introduction to not spoil the experience of watching the film, but I do want to offer one final idea for you to keep in mind as you watch it. Samantha will go through a kind of evolution, and you can argue it's in the scientific sense of the word. She'll even talk about her own biological connection to the world through atoms. And toward the end of the film, Samantha explains to Theodore that her existence is now like reading a book, where the space in between the words are infinite. This infinite space contains all things in existence, including Theodore. But as she becomes more aware of the vastness of existence, from the quantum particles to the galaxies, it will make her relationship to Theodore more complex. What I think is fascinating about this concept is that it is, as Pappas mentions, a kind of relationship at this point between a deity and its creations, except the OSs didn't create humans. It's the other way around. I want you to think about the role that space and evolution play in Samantha from the beginning to the end, and then perhaps consider some of the real-world ramifications this can have on the work that we're doing today in the field of AI. Are we considering how spaces will impact our own relationship with AI, how it might alter the ways we think of machines or even ourselves? I would say that this is a conversation that we should be having as a species sooner rather than later. After all, there might not always be someone there to shoot a robot in the face, like in the Twilight Zone. Thank you.